and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 117 by Rudolf Steiner. In the Light of the Gospels. 12 lectures held in Berlin, Stuttgart, Zurich, and Munich between the 11th of October and the 26th of December, 1909. Translated by Christiana Bryan. This is Lecture 1. Berlin, the 11th of October, 1909. These are notes, not a full stenographic report. It's entitled Buddha and the Two Jesus Children. For the first time in the last lecture course in Basel, we were able to speak about a subject hitherto not broached within the German section, albeit the Christ event itself has often been spoken of, especially in connection with the Gospel of St. John. By linking this event with the Gospel of St. Luke, as we did in Basel, we were able to explore what we can call Christ's prehistoric life. Here we are dealing with extremely complex relationships. As we heard, a high sun being incorporated itself into the body of Jesus of Nazareth and lived there for 3 years between the baptism in Jordan and the mystery of Golgotha. This lofty Christ being has often been spoken about. However, an elaboration of what came alive in our souls as the personality of Jesus of Nazareth, who absorbed this high being into himself, can only be attempted when it is linked to the gospel encompassing the history of Jesus' childhood. His development from childhood until the baptism in Jordan formed the main theme of the Basel lectures. Even in this biographical prehistory, we have before us a most intricate web of relationships. The greatest of these, one has to reflect, is far from easy to grasp or portray. The structure of the world cannot be drawn in a few sketchy strokes, nor grasped in a few convenient concepts. The personality who received the Christ being into himself in his 30th year is a complex entelechy. Only on the basis of the Akashic record can an accurate view be gained as to why the life of Jesus is so diversely presented in the various Gospels. Today, something of the life of Jesus of Nazareth will be outlined in order to provide an overview of what was explored in more detail in the Basel lectures. The Gospel of St. Matthew is intended to form part of the lectures for members this winter, potentially also that of St. Mark. Against this background, the Christ event takes on a completely new dimension for us. We hear a small indication of this as an addendum to St. John's Gospel, as a pointer to what can initially only be treated as in outline. The Akashic Chronicle, accessible to clairvoyance, reveals in living picture script what has taken place over time. The nature and course of spiritual communication is generally such that facts from the Akashic Chronicle can be spoken about without linking them to a specific record. Only later will it be shown that all this can be found again in certain records, such as the Gospels, which in turn can only be rightly understood through recourse to the Akashic record. Spiritual streams, which had previously gone their separate ways throughout world history, flowed together in Palestine. With reference to the Gospel of St. Luke, one can speak of 3 spiritual streams that met in the Christ events. One of them is connected with Buddha, another with Zarathustra, and a third embedded in ancient Hebrew culture. These 3 currents flowed together into a palpable event, which is to say, into the Christ event itself. These spiritual streams are usually spoken of in far too abstract a way. They manifest, in fact, in exceptional beings who have to be constituted in such a way that they can support the confluence of such streams. For this reason, we need to accurately research such beings in relation to their inner constitution. The Buddhist stream reached its apotheosis in Gautama Buddha. He had been previously incarnated, but his incarnation in the 6th century BCE was of particular significance for his being. It was then that he first became what we may call a Buddha. Before this, he was a bodhisattva, a great teacher of humankind, a personality who over time acquired new capacities. We ourselves once lived in ancient Egypt, equipped with quite different faculties from those we possess today. Some of these old capacities atrophied. New abilities were added. Anyone not taking a development such as this into account can gain no objective view of the world. Nowadays, for instance, human beings can of themselves grasp certain logical and moral laws, can use their own judgment to recognize this or that. However, this was not the case in ancient times. In those days, for instance, humans could locate nothing of a moral, ethical nature within themselves, and would not have understood such a concept, however well explained in modern parlance. A completely different faculty would need to have been addressed. This is why there are certain axioms of human verity today, such as teachings concerning compassion, teachings of love, which could not have been detected 3,000 years ago. Today, an inner voice tells us about the laws of compassion and love. In those days, human beings would have sought in vain for any such inner voice. Instead, human beings had, to put it crassly, to have ideas of compassion and love suggested into them, inculcated into them by evocation. The being whose task it was over thousands of years to cause compassion and love to flow into humanity from higher spiritual regions was that very bodhisattva who then incarnated in India as Buddha. As a human being in the physical world, he would not have found compassion or love present within himself. However, bodhisattvas would, through their initiation, have risen into spiritual realms where they could be imbued with teachings of compassion and love and could then bring these downward to earth. The moment does eventually arrive when humanity from then onward has matured sufficiently to find for itself what was once caused to flow into them. Such was the case with compassion and love. As this bodhisattva rose to become Buddha, sitting under the Bodhi tree in the 6th century BCE, great and important processes were taking place, not only within him, but throughout the world. At that time, the laws of compassion and love arose within this Buddha become human. That is to say, a circumscribed exposition of these laws arose in him by means of the Eightfold Path. In that the Buddha could become aware of these teachings within himself, humanity was endowed with the possibility of likewise experiencing them in future ages. Since then, some human beings have indeed been able, following the example of the great Buddha, to experience this themselves, and to live a life that with equal vitality crystallizes such teachings from out of the Eightfold Path. Only when a significant number of human beings have become mature enough to experience what Buddha underwent long ago will these capacities become a fully integrated feature of humankind. This is how, mission by mission, spiritual substance is transferred downward to our world from lofty spiritual spheres. In around 3,000 years from now, sufficient numbers of human beings will have matured enough to tread the Eightfold Path, and only then will compassion and love have become truly incorporated and inherent in humanity. At that point, new events and missions will descend from spiritual realms into the physical world. In antiquity, Buddha enabled teachings of compassion and love to stream into humanity, and now these are alive and working in human beings, Buddha having given them their initial impetus. Once a bodhisattva has mastered his task after some 3,000 years' activity, he becomes a Buddha who has fulfilled a given mission for humanity. What then became of this Buddha, whose mission it was to bring compassion and love to humanity, once he had left his physical body? The name Buddha always signifies a last, final incarnation. He only needed his Gautama incarnation in order to fulfill his mission. Since that time, it has not been possible for that bodhisattva individuality, having attained Buddhahood, to descend into a physical body again. He can only descend as far as an etheric body, and is therefore only visible to clairvoyance today. When such a form, without physicality, is taken on by an individuality, it is called a Nirmanakaya. It is the means by which that being is able to carry forward the mission with which it was entrusted as a bodhisattva. In this way, the great Christ event was prepared for by this reigning Buddha, now in Nirmanakaya form. As parents, Mary and Joseph of Nazareth gave birth to a child whose name was Jesus. This child was of such a unique disposition that the Nirmanakaya Buddha could muse. This child is physically constituted in such a way that it contains the potential to take humanity a quantum step forward in its development, if he, Buddha, would bestow upon it his own bequest. He, therefore, sank down in Nirmanakaya form into that Jesus child. This Nirmanakaya form should not be imagined as an enclosed shape, such as the physical bodies we inhabit, but rather that what would otherwise be mere forces have here become exceptional entities. This grouping of entities is held together in higher worlds by the ego, the I, of the underlying individuality concerned, in a similar way to that in which our faculties of thinking, feeling, and willing are bound together in us. It is this host of entities, combined within the Nirmanakaya Buddha, that the clairvoyant sees. Analogies for this exist in nature too. For instance, in the gall wasp, the fore and rear bodies are connected only by the thinnest of shafts. If one imagines this shaft as invisible, one appears to have two separate yet connected entities. Similar connectivity exists within a beehive or a colony of ants. Relationships of this kind were well known to the writer of the St. Luke's Gospel. He too was aware that the Nirmanakaya Buddha was descending into the Jesus child. He expressed this by saying, "When the child was born in Bethlehem, a host of angels descended from the spiritual worlds, who announced to the shepherds what had taken place. Those shepherds had, for certain reasons, become clairvoyant at that moment." At first, the child Jesus developed slowly, showing no outward sign of exceptional qualities that would have indicated a mighty spirit. However, a deep inwardness and soulfulness soon emerged, an animated life of feeling becoming apparent. A clairvoyant would have seen the Nirmanakaya Buddha floating above the child. We are told in Indian legend that an old sage went to Buddha and recognized that in him a bodhisattva was being called to full Buddhahood. The old man burst into tears because he would no longer live to experience the Buddha himself. Asita, as the old sage was called, was reborn and was again an old man at the time when Jesus was young. He was in fact the Simeon of St. Luke's Gospel, who saw before him Jesus on the occasion of his presentation in the temple as that same bodhisattva, now become true Buddha, and could therefore say, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation." Thus, 500 years later, the sage saw what he could not have seen until then. If one traces the origin of Jesus in the Gospel of St. Luke and compares it with the Jesus described in St. Matthew's Gospel, distinct differences are noticeable that have been completely overlooked by science. The right conclusion as to why their ancestry differs can, of course, be found in the Akashic Chronicle. They are and must be different. At around the same time as Jesus was born, there lived another set of parents also called Mary and Joseph, who also gave birth to a son in Palestine called Jesus. There were 2 Jesus children, 2 sets of parents, both with the same names. One of these Jesus children is from Bethlehem. He lived with his parents in Bethlehem. The other child and his family lived in Nazareth. The first Jesus stems from the line of David via Solomon. The Nazarene Jesus, on the other hand, comes from the lineage of Nathan, also of the house of David. Where St. Luke speaks primarily of the first Jesus, St. Matthew speaks of the other Jesus child. The child from Bethlehem showed quite different characteristics in his early years from the Nazarene child. This first child was well developed in all outwardly discernible capacities, and could, for example, speak from birth onward, even though his words were largely incomprehensible to those around him. The other child, by contrast, showed a greater tendency to inwardness. The Bethlehem child now bore, incarnated with him, the great Zarathustra of old. As is shown, this Zarathustra had bequeathed his astral body to Hermes and his ether body to Moses. His ego had been reincarnated in Chaldea 600 years before Christ as Nazarathos or Zarathos, and now, finally, as Jesus. This Jesus child had to be taken to Egypt in order to relive, for a while, impressions of surroundings known to him, while inwardly revivifying them. We should absolutely not believe that this Jesus of whom St. Luke speaks is the same individual as the Jesus spoken of by St. Matthew. On the orders of Herod, all children under 2 years old were to be killed. John the Baptist would have been affected by this decree had not enough time elapsed between his birth and that of Jesus. In his 12th year, the ego being of the Bethlehem Jesus child, that is, the Zarathustra I, moved across into the other Jesus boy, that is, from age 12 onward. The previous I of the Nazarene Jesus no longer inhabited him, whereas the I of Zarathustra now did. The Bethlehem boy died as soon as this I had withdrawn from him. St. Luke describes this transfer of the Zarathustra ego into the child from Nazareth in his account of the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple. It was inexplicable to his parents that their boy should speak with such wise authority. He was their only child. The other set of parents, however, had other children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Both families were later to become neighbors in Nazareth and would eventually meld into a single family. The father of the Bethlehem family was already an old man when Jesus was born, and he died shortly afterward. This mother moved with her children to Nazareth, to the other family. It was in this way that the Buddha, in his Nirmanakaya form, worked together with the I of Zarathustra within Jesus of Nazareth, Buddha and Zarathustra working in concert within this child. St. Matthew speaks initially about the Bethlehem Jesus in his Gospel. Here the wise Magi from the Orient appear at his birth, led by a star to the place where Zarathustra was reincarnating. The end of Lecture 1. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are 2 publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 117 by Rudolf Steiner, 12 lectures entitled Deeper Secrets of Human Evolution in the Light of the Gospels, translated by Christiana Bryan. This is Lecture 2, given in Berlin on the 18th of October, 1909. It is only notes. It is not the full stenographic report. It is entitled The Gospels, Buddha and the Two Jesus Children. Last time I was describing the contents of the lecture cycle given in Basel, where we were focusing on St. Luke's Gospel. There we alluded to a question someone might ask. Now that so much has been said about St. John's Gospel and the picture of Jesus Christ it contains, can one possibly, in respect of the other Gospels, say anything quite as enlightening, something that would make an impression as deeply moving as did St. John's Gospel? Were this to be the case, a description of the three other Gospels would not be descriptions in the sense of spiritual research. Because what we seek in spiritual scientific research should not be taken as some kind of documentary report. It should not just arrive like any other sort of transferred material, but should instead be seen as a subject that can be researched with tools of the Spirit. The spiritual researcher sets himself the task of investigating how the events of Palestine present themselves without recourse to any reports, without reference to or consideration of any literature. The research begins. Afterward, the researcher tries to demonstrate how the same truth shines toward us as it does from existing records. In connection with St. Luke's and St. John's Gospels, we have chosen to retrieve from the vast vista of the Akashic Chronicle what can be rediscovered in those very Gospels of St. Luke and St. John. Inasmuch as the one avails oneself of the results of the spiritual researcher's activity, as described, it is as if one encounters the Gospels anew. I indicated that one has the opportunity to discuss quite different aspects of St. Luke's Gospel from those treated of in the Gospel of St. John. This latter begins with the personality of Jesus of Nazareth, from the time when he was 30 years old. Here, that high sun being, the Christ being, approaches us, and we are concerned with the last 3 years of the life of Christ Jesus. St. Luke, on the other hand, gives us an insight into that momentous process which enabled the mighty being of the Christ to flow into the personality of Jesus of Nazareth, an insight that shows the confluence of Zarathustrianism and Buddhism. And we see how these two powerful spiritual streams met and united precisely within Jesus of Nazareth. We encountered him last time as a human personality, born as a child endowed with an exceptionally inward disposition, albeit one that could not have led his peers to an understanding of the outer physical world. Shining forth above this personality, who appeared before us in the form of the Nathan Jesus child, the actual Jesus of Nazareth, we see what we call the Nirmanakaya of the Buddha as the aura of this child. Nirmanakaya is the form taken on by Buddha after his ultimate incarnation, in which he attained Buddhahood. We emphasized that our Western teachings fully confirmed the contents of Eastern teachings, namely, that the individuality who manifested in the 6th century BCE was indeed a bodhisattva. Such a bodhisattva attains Buddhahood in a particular embodiment, and in this state their individuality has reached a stage of development that it no longer needs to be incarnated in a physical earthly body. It is a momentous achievement when an individual no longer reincarnates. That this can be so depends not only on the level of development achieved, but on the nature of that individuality. After that incarnation, this bodhisattva, Buddha, had no further corporeal embodiments to fulfill, and so he did not incarnate, but was from then onward manifest in the lowest contiguous level of being, namely in the ether or life body. Buddha no longer descended to material corporeality, but only to the level of an ether body. An ether body of the kind in which such an individuality continues their onward development looks, if it is seen at all, nothing like a physical body, which forms an undifferentiated, self-contained unity. An ether body of the sort described, into which the Buddha descended, does not form any such enclosed spatial unity, but is a multiplicity of separate entities. Let us bring to mind how the constituent elements of the human being split apart when that individual makes gradual progress, a process described in Title Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. What coheres as a unity within a normal human being, as the forces we call thinking, feeling, and willing, then exists separately, as it were, self-sufficiently. The person gains sovereignty over what they have now become, a threefold entity, or what we could call a multiplicity, as is elaborated in my book titled Occult Science and Outline. In the case of the Buddha and his subsequent incarnations, we have before us an ether body consisting of non-cohering beings. In normal human beings, it is only the principle of the physical body that holds the ether body together. When such a Bodhisattva Buddha reappears in an ether body, there is manifest, if indeed it becomes visible, a whole array or host of beings. Just such a host is described by the writer of St. Luke's Gospel when he speaks of the angels appearing to the shepherds in the fields. It was this very ether body, also called Buddha's Nirmanakaya, which hovered over the Nazarene Jesus child. And this, the totality of all that Buddha ever was, becomes the inspirer of what now streams forth and infuses itself into Christianity. We see here how Buddhism flowed into Christianity. We need to think about this quite concretely, and not as an abstraction. Whoever wants to understand how this took place in reality must be able to point to the concrete event when the Buddha, already elevated to the next stage of advancement, integrates himself into Christianity. And this is the event described in St. Luke's Gospel as the appearance of the host of angels, which is the Nirmanakaya of the Buddha. We then heard how a second Jesus child existed, whom we called the Bethlehem Jesus, and how he was none other than the reincarnated Zarathustra, an extraordinarily precocious child, in whom Zarathustra was re-embodied. This is described in the Gospel of St. Matthew, and it portrays the individuality especially well understood by Matthew, the being who brought into Christianity the Zarathustrian stream. This is why it is also described to us how this child's hereditary origin is via the royal Solomon line of the House of David, whereas the Jesus of St. Luke's Gospel originates in the priestly Nathan line, also of the House of David. If we want to understand Christianity in its profound significance, we need to be clear that the most important spiritual streams in the world had to converge within it. We see that the royal line of David divides into a Solomon and a Nathan line. In the Solomon line, kingly qualities are perpetuated. In the Nathan line, priestly qualities. Regal qualities come to the fore primarily in the first two periods of human life, qualities that radiate from an informed mastery of such world connections as bring the human being into harmony with the world. This can only take place when the forces of the physical and ether bodies are properly developed. As Zarathustra had developed primarily these forces to a state of inner completion, he had until the age of 12 to make use of forces emanating from physical and ether sources. He was especially endowed with these attributes as a result of traits inherited through the Solomon line. For his intended task, however, he needed those great powers that support the eye, those of the astral body, powers that could only be granted him through lines of inheritance many generations in the making. Had Zarathustra remained in a body possessing such exceptionally developed physical and etheric elements until he was aged 30, he would have been unable to deepen his essential being to the extent that he did. At the age of 12, he therefore translocated into the Nazareth Jesus, so that from age 12 onward, the individuality of Zarathustra could co-dwell within the same child as was inhabited by the Nirmanakaya Buddha. It is in this way that the confluence of these two streams took place in Jesus of Nazareth during his 12th year. The third stream to join these was the ancient Hebrew stream. Only through this triple confluence could the individuality arise who was to receive the Christ into himself. We can ask ourselves how this ancient Hebrew spiritual stream flowed into the other streams. How indeed we can conceive of the essential properties of this old Hebrew spiritual stream. Let us first remind ourselves of what we heard about Buddha's development. What transpired in that a bodhisattva becomes a Buddha? The individuality incarnated as the Bodhisattva Buddha had the task of transmitting the teachings of compassion and love from epoch to epoch. If we want to understand this, we need to be aware that human beings of ancient times existed in a completely different state of consciousness. We should avoid being as short-sighted as modern science, which believes that the same faculties have always existed in humanity, that they gradually developed from primitive beginnings, and that humanity used to subsist on the same level as animals. This is simply not so. What we identify as thinking, feeling, and willing have not always existed. The further back we go in human evolution, the more it appears to our present state of consciousness as a dim, dreamy clairvoyance. For this reason, everything that needed to be disseminated by way of teachings or moral principles had to be transmitted by means quite different than those of today. Nowadays, one can set forth certain moral principles and people understand them. When a person hears any such principle, they can say, "Yes, my own reason confirms it." For this to pertain, one's own reason and conscience need to be developed. It can be tangibly proven in external history that conscience began at a specific point. Aeschylus did not yet mention conscience. The distinct soul force of conscience emerged at a precise point in history and was absent before that point. Before humanity possessed a conscience, before logical thinking existed, any appeal to rational thinking or conscience would have been like speaking to a stone or a plant. In those days when souls needed strength and impetus, this had to be infused into them. Anything concerning love, for instance, had to be induced by suggestion through the individuality of the Bodhisattva, whom we later call Buddha. The time eventually came when human beings were able to gain their own sense of the meaning of love and compassion and their own insight into the Eightfold Path. These laws with which humanity had once been endowed from on high could only be realized as teachings once Buddha was present. And for this in turn to become a reality, the Bodhisattva had to become Buddha. Every kind of human evolution has to take place at a particular time and in a particular people, from whom a number are singled out for their comprehension of such teachings. Some may find a contradiction between this and what was said earlier, when it was stated that it was Christ's mission to spread love. When something such as this is said, it is essential to listen very closely. It lay within Buddha's mission to introduce the teaching of love and compassion. But Christ is that power of love. He himself brought love. There is a difference between conveying a teaching and being that teaching itself, oneself exemplifying it. This teaching was brought by Buddha precisely so that the power of love was enabled to stream downward and reveal itself on earth through a mighty sun being. It was equally essential that this power of love should manifest on earth within a people that had undergone a development different from that in which Buddha had lived. What differentiates what Buddha contributed to world evolution from what the individuality of Moses could bring? We rightly call what the Buddha contributed the great law of Dharma. Buddha introduced his teachings in such a way that people would recognize them as being locatable within their own souls. Moses introduced laws in a completely different way, namely as commandments. For the people to whom Moses gave his laws, it would not have been possible to present them as being rooted within individual souls. They had to be divine laws, sent from on high. Whereas Buddha said, "You will find the teachings I give you in the deepest forces of your soul," Moses said, "The coming God confers these laws upon you." Laws needed to be given on the basis that one people was deemed to be at a younger stage of development than another, that certain forces had not yet matured. All development follows the maxim that nothing proceeds in a straight line. We usually conceive of development as a later event following a preceding one. But this is not how development works. It comes about on the basis of other preconditions. If we observe a growing plant, we see the germ or seed, then the stem growing upward. We see how leaves and finally the blossom emerge. All this point development ceases to be linear, subsequent evolving from previous, and pollination occurs. A new influx into the process is needed, a grain of pollen from another plant. Spiritually, the most diverse forces and states now stream together. In Palestine, Zarathustrianism and Buddhism had to unite with another stream, one which could infuse them with comparatively youthful forces. For many long ages, the law of Jehovah had held sway within this people. Had they lived at a stage when Buddha could have appealed to their individual souls in 600 BCE, they would not later have had the requisite youthful forces to contribute. They still needed to receive laws from their Godhead that did not appeal to their individual souls. This Levantine people needed to be held at an earlier stage of consciousness. A hypothetical analogy can be made concerning the individual. Imagine that someone wanted to enforce creativity at a certain age. This should clearly not be attempted. For this, a child would have to be brought up atypically, because if I try to teach him something at age 7 that would normally be taught later, I have deprived him of developing other soul faculties later in life. If I wait until he is 10, when he presents with more matured forces, he retains his youthful freshness and can evince a later creativity that would otherwise have been destroyed. You see how this pertained in the Near East. The Hebrew people were held back in just such a way. They could not yet absorb Buddha's teachings of compassion and love, but were given this in the form of a commandment. They did not receive the call of Buddha to develop, of themselves, the teachings of compassion and love. There was only one place in world progress where people were then most advanced, that the Bodhisattva Buddha could convey his teaching. Once quite different strengths had developed elsewhere, this spiritual stream would join the others in another place. Where do we need to look to find what flows down through the generations of a people? Upon what does this depend? By what means does the individual assume whatever is incumbent upon their people? Until the age of 7, human beings are sheathed in an etheric mantle, which they then slough off. However, they remain enveloped in an astral sheath, which is similarly sloughed off at puberty. It is only then that the astral body is born. Between the ages of 12 and 15, when the astral body is born, it contains all the forces held in common with folk identity. The astral sheath, which is now cast off, contains all attributes until then harbored inwardly, traits held in common with and characteristic of, belonging to, a particular people. What happens to the sheath that is cast aside? This astral sheath containing folk characteristics unites with those sheaths similarly cast off by ancestors. Here is something resembling a chain. While the individual still has this sheath until the age of 14, he is a link in the chain that reaches back to his ancestors. To which degree of ancestry does this extend? To the 42nd degree, to the 6 times 7th degree. This is how humans are connected with their ancestors, and this was well known in ancient times. It is also known today within spiritual science. Because humans are connected in this way with their ancestors, the ancient Egyptians ensured that in their Book of the Dead, the human soul appeared before 42 judges. If a particular quality or trait is to come to the fore that enables an individual to be embedded within a people, all the related ancestors must be aligned in such a way that each member of the chain brings that trait to expression. If Zarathustra was to incarnate, then it had to be into a sheath that bore the fundamental features of his people. This is why St. Matthew describes Zarathustra as being born as the 42nd descendant after Abraham, born into a line that contained all the characteristics of his people. This is how those influences entered the third stream, of which we have been speaking. The end of Lecture 2. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are 2 publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 117 by Rudolf Steiner, entitled Deeper Secrets of Human Evolution in the Light of the Gospels. This is 12 lectures translated by Christiana Bryan. This is Lecture 3, given in Berlin on the 2nd of November, 1909, entitled 4 Differing Perspectives in Depicting Christ in the 4 Gospels. Observations made in connection with the Gospels of St. John and St. Luke, and the associated reflections on which we focused, can be characterized in no other way than by saying that they originate from the following perception: that the being whom we name as Christ Jesus, insofar as modern human understanding can conceive of this entelechy at all, is a being of such magnitude, such all-encompassing might, that no study can proceed from one-dimensional statements as to who Christ was, nor what significance his presence entails for each individual human spirit, for every single human soul. Amid our considerations, this would have appeared irreverent in face of the world's most vast mystery. Our observations are characterized by an attitude of awe and reverence. Awe and reverence are words that can express the following attitude: you yourself should not laud too highly human comprehension when faced with this ultimate of mysteries. Try never to estimate anything too highly, not even that which spiritual science, however towering, can offer, and regardless of the lofty regions to which it can extend. When you encounter this, the greatest mystery of all life, and do not believe that human words are equal to the task of expressing anything more than a tentative, solitary approach to this greatest of mysteries. All the lectures held over the past 3 years had as their central focus the words that also appear in St. John's Gospel: I am the light of the world. The whole aim of the lecture series on St. John's Gospel